Joining me now is our regular panel, Ben Oquist. He's a former Greens advisor, Executive Director at the Australia Institute. He joins us live from Glasgow, and here in the studio, David Gazzard. Nice to have you back face-to-face, DPG Advisory Director, former Liberal advisor. David, before we go to Ben in Glasgow, let's start with you and the broader climate discussion. There's so many elements to it, it's hard to know where to start, from the EV policy to the approach from Matt Keating in the New South Wales government on one side of the debate, to the other side of the debate, like the LNP in Queensland, facing pressures from the likes of Palmer, Hanson, Newman. This is a diabolical challenge for the Prime Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it's a challenge, and you can actually see the shifts in the landscape. I think the federal coalition has decided to take the approach that let the market sort it out. I mean, we are talking out to 2050 here, so that's what, we're 2020 now, that's nearly 30 years. Imagine what we were doing 30 years ago and say, well, you picked up your phone, you had a rotary dial, right? So imagine where we're going to be in 30 years. Best to let the market sort that out, and there changes exploding as we're talking now. There's new technology coming all the time. Let the market sort it out, but establish the critical infrastructure and the spines that will allow that new technology to operate, and allow the market to operate efficiently around that. So rather than mandating electric vehicles, you set up the charging stations to allow the market to fill in those electric vehicles. Now, Ben's going to have a different view on that, but that's a more interventionist approach, whereas the government is more allowing the market to flourish and provide in that area.
And Ben Oquist, to you in Glasgow, doesn't it have an additional credibility to it when you look at the layers of government action? Like I mentioned Matt Keating, they've committed to a very ambitious electric vehicle strategy. In fact, he confirmed to me on the program a bit earlier that the New South Wales government is signing on to the UN COP declaration to speed up the transition to zero emissions vehicles by 2040, Ben.
Yeah, well, it's a Transport Action Day here at the COP. That's good news from Matt Keating. I think you're right. You've got to look at Australia's performance overall, and it's very lucky we've had some state governments willing to take action, because otherwise Australia would be really lagging behind. And increasingly, I'm seeing here in Glasgow, countries are looking for the opportunities that are entailed with tackling climate action, whereas Australia federal government seems to be constantly looking for the excuses not to act. David's right, the private sector is obviously going to play a big role in the transition to a zero carbon economy, but you need the government to act. Of course, if you're letting the market determine it, you put in place a carbon price and let the market decide, but that's not going to happen. But you need strong government action, strong government regulation. And I think that's what's really stark for me sitting here in Glasgow, seeing the energy, the enthusiasm, say, that the United States is putting into tackling climate change. Barack Obama over here at the Climate Summit, John Kerry with his team, a diplomatic tour de force trying to lift ambition on climate change. I think that'll be good for business. Whereas Scott Morrison wasn't here for very long. Angus Taylor is not here at all anymore. We don't have a minister. And I think that's what's missing. Australia's being left behind. Today's announcement is nothing. It's tiny. I mean, I'm a big supporter of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. I helped set it up, helped save it in the Senate, so it's a good vehicle. But the government's simply seeking to prop up fossil fuels by putting more money in for CCS, and it just doesn't match the ambition that we're seeing around the rest of the world. And we can't wait to 2050, I'm afraid. This is the decisive decade. We've got 9 years to sort it out, otherwise we're going to have runaway climate change. And Australia's been MIA here, not signing on to the methane pledge, not signing on to the coal, consigning coal to history pledges, no 2030 target. And I think that's bad for Australia on many fronts, economically, and on the foreign policy front too. We're basically abandoning the US and the UK, our traditional allies, and that's going to have big consequences for Australia, not just Morrison in the short term politically, but in the long term as we're left behind.
What do you say to that, David?
Well,
particularly in the context of how this is received by our allies? Ben's right to say the United States And the UK, among those driving the hardest for change.
They're in completely different positions than we are. Their economies run a different way, although I'd note that a lot of the gains that the US have made have come from shale oil and gas. They've made themselves energy self-sufficient and cut emissions by exploiting those resources. Ben's keen on other times we've met to talk about the IEA. The IEA makes it very explicitly clear that we can't transition to renewables straight away. We need transition fuels along the way. So it's all well and good to be talking about this is the crucial decade and we've got to be putting renewables in. Our energy system can't cope with that right now. We're moving there. We've obviously got high uptake of solar energy. We're going into other areas. We're among the first countries to be talking about hydrogen. We're looking now at green steel. But in the immediate short term, we can't lose sight of the fact our energy is dependent on other forms of fuel. And we don't want to crash our economy. We don't want to bring on an economic winter to solve climate change, global warming.
Ben, just give us a sense, because you are there and obviously monitoring the overall talks, is there a sense of optimism that they will reach some agreement to at least reduce the rate of warming to below 2 degrees Celsius?
I was at an event with John Kerry yesterday. He was very optimistic. He talked about how Barack Obama kept telling him how optimistic he was. And he says that there's some analysis out that the pledges that have been made so far here at the summit could get us, if they're all met, and I think that's a big if, get us to below 2 degrees, at 1.8 degrees. I think there's a lot more work to do. There'll be some success here at Glasgow, but it won't be enough to get us to 1.5 degrees and really start looking at a safer climate and zero in the time we need to get to. But I guess what it is really different from this COP to other ones is the focus on getting off fossil fuels. In the past, fossil fuels were barely not mentioned. Now we've got the president of the COP talking about consigning coal to history. Big deals are done here to accelerate coal phase out. Big deals done to get countries off financing coal sooner rather than later. And that's involved countries, big coal exporting countries like Indonesia. And I think that's the real difference. And yes, we're going to need technology. I think Malcolm Turnbull and Twiggy Forrest have been here extolling the virtues of that, doing a good job for Australia, I might add, in the absence of a Prime Minister and an Energy Minister. But it's that getting off fossil fuels as fast as we can that's been a big change in the dynamic of these COPs and the international climate debate that's really happened in the last years. And that's left Australia floundering both on climate policy, but increasingly on foreign policy. Climate policy is now economic policy, but it's also foreign policy. And Australia is being left behind, and with our Pacific neighbours, as well as our forever allies, the United Kingdom and the United States.
It all sounds great. It's all lovely to sit around the fireplace singing Kumbaya and holding hands. But what's happened in England this year? They've brought on more coal-fired plants across Europe because the wind hasn't blown. So no one's arguing that we shouldn't be transitioning to these fuels. We're saying do it in a prudent way that's going to keep our economies going while we can make that transition. I mean, England is buying coal-fired power right now from Poland because they haven't been able to meet their renewable targets. They've also got nuclear power that they can bring on. So let's do this in a sensible, managed way. Yes, we're all transitioning there, but make sure we don't crash the economy on the way.
Before we go, David, can we expect the Prime Minister to pick up on another Prime Minister that's had a crack at his own party, not the one that Ben Oquist mentioned there in Glasgow, who's been having a crack at the Liberals, but today, former Prime Minister Keating, because he was critical of both sides of politics.
He was certainly critical of both sides. He had a massive swing at Penny Wong. You sort of get the feeling that Keating hasn't much moved on from calling us the poor white trash of Asia and being very Asia-focused. I think he may have done some work in China, so you can see why some think he's a shill for China. But I don't buy what he's arguing, because I think the intelligence that will be going to our administration and to the opposition is much more up to date. Things have changed dramatically since he was Prime Minister. you know, if it comes down to a guy that's held these views for sort of 30, 40 years and the intelligence that our secret services are providing now, I think I'm backing the current regime.
Ben Oquist, I know it's only not even 6 a.m. there. You probably haven't seen the speech, but if you've picked up anything from what Paul Keating said overnight, he certainly hasn't lost his flourish, his rhetorical flourish, that's for sure, calling Boris Johnson old coconut head among some of his other lines. But from what you've seen, what did you make of it?
Well, Australia needs a better foreign policy debate, and I think it's a good thing that we've got a bigger, more robust one. It doesn't meet the front pages enough, and I don't think we're being led well in foreign policy at the moment. I mentioned climate change. It's really affecting our foreign relationship. That's the big change here in Glasgow, and sorry to come back to it, but you've seen a massive shift. Australia and the United States used to be joined on climate policy a lot. But we've seen a massive divergence here, and I think that's what's missing from our foreign policies and engagement on climate change. And I think that would do us a great deal of service in the Pacific, with our Pacific neighbours, in helping balance China. I don't agree with every part of Keating's speech, but boy, oh boy, we need a better foreign policy. And to do that, we need a better foreign policy debate, and good on him for intervening.
Ben, thank you for getting up early there in Glasgow. Appreciate it. David Gazzard.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.